process. In today's lecture, it's some theory. There's absolutely some fundamental principles I want to talk to you about, because I think that this really provides the foundation of a context for everything that we do as coaches and trainers and therapists, because really it's about understanding what the body is doing. It's about opening the black box and saying, what happens when we do this? Why does this happen? If I train this way, why do I get this result? If I train that way, why do I get a different result? And that's really the key to understanding as coaches and therapists, because you want to know what your methods are going to do, and you want to know why it's going to do that. Because if you don't, realistically, you're guessing. You're thinking, this is what I want to happen. Hopefully it happens. If it happens, great, but you really don't know why. So we're going to talk about that. Why? Why does one outcome happen versus another? So we'll start out first designing or talk about what is allostasis. And this is a long definition you don't really need to memorize, but it's the very integrated adaptive responses taken by the body in order to maintain homeostasis at all times, in all circumstances. Because if homeostasis isn't maintained, you're dead, right? You can't live long without energy production, and you have to maintain homeostasis to produce energy. So what is homeostasis, right? Homeostasis is something most of you are familiar with. It's simply the body has to maintain temperature and blood pH and blood pressure, hydration and blood sugar. It has to maintain all these parameters within normal ranges because it has to maintain energy production at all times. Right? I've kind of become known as the energy production guy, which is fine with me because realistically energy is everything. If your cells don't have ATP, you're not going to last long. So everything at the end of the day comes down to energy production. And if you listen to guys like Sapolsky and McEwen, and they talk about our bodies are designed to do one thing, that's stay alive and reproduce. And the staying alive part is energy production. So everything comes down to our ability to maintain homeostasis at all times. And the way that happens is with allostasis. Okay, allostasis is like the puppeteer. The brain is the puppeteer pulling all the strings to make sure those things stay within normal ranges at all times so you continue to stay alive. So we look at allostasis, it's essentially mediated by the brain. The brain gets a lot of feedback from the periphery and makes decisions of how to make sure you stay within those normal ranges. Okay, it adjusts and regulates homeostatic norms and set points based on the situation. So it can actually change those homeostatic set points. It can change your normal level of blood pressure. It can change different parameters based on the context of the situation. Okay, it also includes both behavioral and physiological modifications. So for example, let's say I go on a diet. My brain senses there's a lack of calories coming in. It can make a behavioral modification and make me hungry. Okay, that's an actual behavioral change that was stimulated by my dieting. The brain sensed everything and made a behavioral change. So it can basically do both things, both behaviorally and physiologically, in order to get the outcome that's looking for and maintain homeostasis. Okay, it also uses hormones, neurotransmitters, cytokines, and all sorts of different stuff as messengers. Because at the end of the day, the brain's got to communicate with the rest of the body. What's the rest of the body doing? And then it's got to influence the rest of the body to do what it wants. And it uses a whole host of these different things to do that. It's a constant communication between the brain and everything else in your body, because the brain's got to regulate everything somehow, and the only way you can do that is talk to it. Okay? Next, it's really the difference is allostasis is made up of components that vary wildly. Okay? They're big ranges. So there's a much bigger range of enzyme levels and different things than there is the homeostatic element. So your blood pressure is not going to go beyond a certain range where you can get 300 or 400% increases in hormones. So the hormones and all these things that change much more drastically are really the allostatic component to the whole process. Okay, next we can look at allostasis in terms of the load. Okay, we look at training load, the frequency, the training history, the fitness level. All of these things dictate how much load we place on our body, allostatic load. Basically, it's how much we force our body to work in order to maintain homeostasis. If I'm just walking down the street, I don't need a ton of extra energy, just fairly low level stuff. That's a much lower load than sprinting down the street. You're doing sprint after sprint or playing the game. Those things require much more coordination, much more work in order for the body to maintain homeostasis. So we consider those things to have a much more allostatic load or much higher allostatic load. And we really have to consider that on the left side of the graph, there's the things that we control as strength coaches for the most part. Right? We have very little control over genetics. We have some influence over sleep. We can influence nutrition to some extent. But really the stuff on the left is where strength coaches, we have our input, and personal trainers and therapists, that's where we have our input of how much load or how much the body has to work in order to maintain. Next, this is where things start to get tricky. This is where we're pushing the body too much load. So let's say we hit stage 2, great, our strength improved, our endurance improved, our work capacity improved, but then we hit a plateau. The same load didn't have the same effect, we got to do something. We can't just keep training without any improvements. So now we increase the work we say we double training sessions, we just do way too much. Okay, we start to actually push into what we consider an overreaching stage. Okay, now during overreaching, what we're seeing is that we've lowered the body so much that now it's turning down its receptiveness or its sensitivity to these different hormones that get produced. It's like I said, if the neighbor keeps shouting at you every day, eventually you're going to just plug your ears. You're going to wear earplugs so you don't hear them. And that's really what the body does. If you blast it with catecholamine and glucocorticoids over and over again, eventually it just turns down its sensitivity to those because it's too much. That's how it's going to respond. Now, you can still maintain its fitness levels to some extent by just increasing the production. So the brain, the muscles say, well, this is too much, I don't want that. So it turns down sensitivity. The brain says, well, you still need it, so it just produces more of it. Well, now you produce more of it, again, the muscle says, whoa, and this is way too much, and it decreases its sensitivity even more. So you get this negative feedback loop that just spirals. And eventually, if you keep pushing through that, you end up with this stage 4, what we really consider overtraining, and that's where the whole body says, okay, this is way too much, it's going to just decrease its entire central production. So rather than saying, I'm just going to decrease sensitivity, it just says, I'm going to stop producing cortisol, or I'm going to, not stop, I'm going to drastically reduce my cortisol production. I'm going to drastically reduce how much adrenaline and noradrenaline produce. And do all these things because it's just overload. It doesn't know what else to do, it just shuts down its production. Okay, and this is where we really see persistent decreases in strength, power, endurance, performance. All these things are going to go down because the body can't adequately respond to stress. It doesn't have the hormones, it doesn't have the energy it needs. It just can't respond to the training session or to the competition the way that it should because it doesn't have the capacity to respond. It's turned down sensitivity, it's turned down hormones, it's turned down energy-making machinery. So it can't do what you want it to do. Now, it can be, one thing that's interesting is it may be triggered by chronic inflammation. So if inflammation happens in the joint over and over again, eventually that signal goes up to the brain, and that can actually directly impact all of the systems. So that's considered the cytokine hypothesis of overtraining. Really just tells us that the brain and muscles are in constant communication, and one of the biggest communicators is the immune system, which is almost never talked about when it comes to training, but the immune system has a huge impact on how the brain perceives what's going on, because when you train, it produces localized inflammation, and that signals the body something's going on. And there's also behavioral changes. Remember, allostasis has a mental component, behavioral changes. So that can lead to lack of desire to train, depression, lethargy, all those things. And again, that's the brain's attempt to get you to stop doing what you're doing. We want you to stop training or to reduce the load. And part of those changes is allostatically it will signal the brain to make you feel like you don't want to work out, I don't want to train. If you're dieting, you want to eat food. It's going to make all these behavioral modifications to get you to stop doing whatever it is you're doing that senses is too much. So we can look at some of the research. This one group, they basically overtrained the crap out of these guys. They did 10 sets at 1 rep max every day for 2 weeks, whereas the control group just did normal training twice a week. So what we saw is the group that overtrained, they saw a 37% decrease in those receptors, the androgen receptors in the muscle, which the catecholamine and adrenaline bind to, which is a very important force and power. So again, we blast it with this high intensity for 2 weeks straight, while it decreases receptors by 37%. They said that overtraining occurred, 5% decrease in 1 rep max, 36% decrease in power. So we see power is actually more effective than maximal strength, which is obviously hugely important in more sports. With 2 weeks of overtraining, literally only 2 weeks of overtraining, there was a 36% decrease in power. That's a huge amount. That's a third of your power gone after 2 weeks of intensely overtraining. Obviously, most people aren't going to do 10 sets of their 1 rep max every day for 2 weeks. But the loading during the season, during a lot of stuff that you're doing, can reach pretty high levels and cause it to happen pretty quickly at the point. These guys literally, within 2 weeks, a third of power is gone, the strength is down. So